Good evening. Welcome you all for this seminar. Today we have Professor Shawn from HBS. Shawn has been working on, I think, development economics for long, but he has recently moved to new areas of, I think, experiments and huge data, and from there getting something of policy insights. I think this is one area which he has been working on maybe last 1 year or so.
Longer.
Okay. So on the promise and challenges of implementing ICT in agriculture. I know Shawn for more than 1.5 decades. So my association with him goes long back. So he is a PhD from MIT, and then since then he is with HBS. His work has appeared in journals like Quarterly Journal of Economics, the year Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, all leading journals. So I think with that I just hand it over to Shawn. Maybe around 45 minutes if you speak, and in between you can take questions. So
that sounds fine. I'm also happy to take questions as we go along. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's a real pleasure to be here, be back at IIM Ahmedabad. I've been here probably 6 times already in my career. I have to give a disclaimer at the start of this talk, which is I am also the board member of a nonprofit called Precision Agriculture for Development, which is seeking to test, evaluate, and potentially scale ICT for agriculture. So you should be aware of that as you consume this research. This research is academic research. And actually, I have to leave by 6, I guess, because your placement office has scheduled me a meeting at 6 to talk about the nonprofit in case people are interested in joining the nonprofit. So, but I'm available. It's hard to find my email on the website, but s@hbs.edu if you have any comments or follow-up questions. I'm more than happy to interact. And so I'm going to talk about two papers here, which are really right now, I think, the only work products out of this stream of research. But we're basically building a research machine in the ICT Ag Extension space. So the first paper is joint work with Nilesh Fernando, who's a PhD student at Harvard and is now on the faculty at Notre Dame. Before that, he was an RA for me, actually, in Ahmedabad. And the second paper, this is an older paper, but still not published. Some of you colleagues, academics, may be familiar with that feature of research. This is a very new paper. It was written for a policy forum, but I think it's very policy relevant right now given the government push to distribute soil health cards to the nation. And so I'll present both of these papers. These are, the presentation is kind of aimed at a mix between an academic audience and a policy maker audience. So you'll occasionally see standard errors, but you won't see regression equations. It's pretty simple RCTs, so you don't necessarily need those equations. But then let me start with this, and I'll give you just a summary or a taste of this paper because it's relatively older. But we know that there's a lot of variation in agricultural productivity around the world and sort of a yield gap in many developing countries. That doesn't mean that, I think there's a temptation when you write papers like this to say the doom and gloom, the world is collapsing. But Indian agricultural productivity has been growing, and the speed of growth has actually increased, I guess, in the past decade to about 3.5% over a 2.5% rate earlier on. So it's not like, it's not the Hindu rate of agricultural growth, but there's, nevertheless a view that many farming practices may be inefficient or ineffective. And so this paper is looking at an alternative way of delivering agricultural extension services that solves some of the problems that traditional extension services might face, such as the spatial frictions, right? So if you look at the NSS data, only 7% of households have interacted with an agricultural extension worker in the past year, and it's very expensive and time-consuming and often unpleasant to get in a car or a bike and drive around from farm to farm and talk to farmers and give education. There's a problem with traditional extension, perhaps in the immediacy of information. So you could gather all the farmers and organize a seminar and give them information, but it could be 6 weeks later they get a pest that you didn't anticipate, and you didn't teach them about that type of pest, and you're not around then to solve that problem. And then there's also just the question of what type of information should you be disseminating, because extension has limited capacity to educate, and people have limited capacity to pay attention. And so can a bureaucrat sitting in a district headquarters really figure out what the optimal extension schedule would be for these blocks or these districts over the next year. So mobile phones may help solve some of these problems. And then, the other question that we're interested in is, does information only affect agricultural practices? I think there are a lot of, certainly the history of the Poverty Action Lab is littered with interventions that provided information in the hopes of changing behavior and often didn't see changes in behavior. So those are the big picture questions that we're interested in here. We did not create this extension product. This is a social enterprise created by 2 computer scientists, one at Berkeley, Tapan Parikh, and one at Stanford, Neil Patel. Some of you may know Neil. He has since left academia, or he finished his PhD, but now he's in Ahmedabad and he runs a social enterprise called Avaz Day, which is selling this voice-based product to dozens or probably hundreds of users and use cases, often nonprofits in India, but also in other countries. So the service we worked with was something that he had started with an NGO development support center, which is, again, based in Ahmedabad, but takes care of rural areas around here. And they were focused on cotton. And so the service, as we evaluated it, was pretty simple. It provided a weekly push call between 2 to 5 minutes in length to farmers once a week. Their phone would ring at no cost to them. There's a question and answer service, which was you could call in and ask a question, and it was a voicemail box. You'd record the question, and then within 24 to 48 hours, you would get a voice message delivered back to you that was the answer to the question. And if you weren't satisfied or you wanted further clarification, you could, the message would beep, and you could record a clarification request, and that would get sent back to the agronomist. And so the advantage over this over a call center is just costs. It's much easier to manage the workflow of voicemail messages than staffing a live call center where you might get a lot of queries at 6 p.m. and none at 3 p.m. And there's also a scalability feature in the sense that once you've already answered a question and recorded the answer, you can then send that same answer to the next farmer who asks the question rather than having to answer it live again. And so, currently we have a service running and we have 2 agronomists who are able to handle something like 300 queries a day. So that's a relatively high level of productivity compared to what they could do, I think, with a live call center. So it's an RCT, 1,200 cotton farmers in Gujarat, randomly selected from a sample of all cotton farmers. So the only screen to be in our sample was you are a cotton farmer and you have a mobile phone. An alternative design might have looked for people who are interested in the service, which probably would have been younger people and more tech-savvy people. And I guess we might have found a bigger effect if we had done that, but it would have been representative, not representative of the average population. So the average person in our sample is 46 years old, which is, at least by, still seems old to me, although I'm approaching that very quickly. Has very little education, 4 years of education, and I think a lot of land, 6 acres of land. Study design was it would have been a 2x2 if we had had the budget for it, but we didn't. So we cut out one of the arms. We have a pure control group. We have a group that gets the AO service only, so just the phone service. And then we have a group that gets the phone service plus the physical extension. And we had some physical extension because we had heard a lot of pushback from experts or people with field experience saying you can't change behavior by technology alone. You have to have some human component. So we said, okay, we'll build that in there as well. It would have been nice to have had a physical extension only intervention as well, but we didn't, and I'm not that optimistic it would have been that effective because this was a very light touch physical extension. It was just once a year. We invited farmers in for about a 3 to 4 hour demonstration period on cotton farming. Then within the treatment group of these 800 people who are getting the service, we were interested in whether the intensity of use would matter. So half of those people we randomly assigned to receive reminders, periodic reminders every week or every few weeks. Remember, you have the service. You can call in and ask a question if you have a question, right? And so the paper shows that there was a pretty strong first stage that caused people to use the service, I think, about 30 or 40 minutes more than the people who didn't get the reminders. Okay, so there's some first stage there. One takeaway from the paper that's, I think, practically relevant, not that necessarily academically interesting, but very high level of usage. So 63% of the treatment population called in with a question, right? And these are people, average age is 46, so there are a lot of very old people, but they're somehow figuring out how to operate this touchtone system, press 1 to record the question, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the content was listened to. So if you take the total amount of content that somebody could have listened to if they had never hung up the phone and they had answered every call, that would have been about 4 hours. And on average, they're listening to about 2 hours of the content over a 2-year period. Oh, the control group doesn't know about the service. No, we just do a baseline survey about their farming practices and their agricultural productivity, but we don't tell them anything about the service.
So when you say prepaid population, it is AO service only or AO service only plus the physical?
This is AO only. This is AO service plus the. Yeah. So right. So you could imagine that it is sensible to compare any of these 3 groups to each other, right? It turns out that there's never any statistically significant difference between these 2 groups, which in some sense is really good news if you're concerned about the scalability of this, because the text side is a lot more scalable than the physical extension side, arguably. And then, so I think for the purpose of the rest of the slides, I'm clubbing these 2 together and comparing them to the control group.
So the fact that you're using people with 6 acres of land, that signals to me that they're slightly rich and they might know how to use the mobile phone. So how relevant is this to people who don't have?
I think that's a great question. So we're underpowered. We only have 1,200 people in the sample. And so we can't really detect heterogeneous impacts. I will say that things like usage do not depend much on education. So it's not that more educated or people with more land are much more likely to call in and ask a question or listen to the content. So that we have, a nice thing about this, those of you who have done field experiments, you know that survey instruments are often extremely noisy. You've got attrition problems. We actually have very low attrition here because we went strongly after that. But then you also have recall problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so we measure, the computer records how many minutes each person interacts with the system and how they interact with the system. So those, we can do some heterogeneous effects there, and those are relatively precise. And we don't find too strong of a gradient with respect to education. But I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, and it's in the paper. One thing we asked is just at the end of the period, what's your primary source of information on the following topics, right? And so we find this is the share of people who report a mobile phone as the primary source for cotton pesticides goes up by 16 percentage points, and that's statistically significant at the 1% level. Cotton fertilizers is 7%. I think it's the 10% level. So effect here, no effect on wheat pesticides. We had a bit of information on wheat pesticides. This, in my sense, I find this very reassuring because most of our information was about pesticides, fertilizers, and pest identification. So that's what they were asking us about, and that's the type of content we were giving. We never gave price information, right? And in fact, our point estimate on prices is 0%, which it suggests it's not just a surveyor demand effect that they want us to think they're happy with the service, so we continue to give it to them for free or something. That doesn't seem to be the case. So we're changing sources of agricultural information. We also actually reduce the probability if you're a treatment farmer, we reduce the probability you go to visit other farmers' fields or talk to other farmers, because I guess you can learn more from the service than have to rely on your neighbor who you may or may not trust. In terms of agricultural practices, the paper reports the individual agricultural practices like pesticide choice and fertilizer choice, but for this purpose, we analyze them just as an index. Our agronomist codes every practice as either 1 is best practice, 0 is it may or may not be appropriate, without more information, and -1 is not in a bad practice, like objectively something they shouldn't be doing. And so we find the statistically significant effects of about 0.08 standard deviations of this index on pest management practices, on fertilizer practices, and on sowing and input practices, right? So this, to me, this is maybe the most important thing we learn from this paper, which is that just information can change farming practices relatively systematically. Interestingly, we don't find a measured effect on knowledge. So we asked them in the end-line survey, we asked them 30 questions about agricultural practices, and the treatment group's not any more likely to get those questions right than the control group. And so our theory of change seems to be more, the doctor tells me what to do, I don't learn that eating high-fat food raises my cholesterol, clogs my veins, and causes a heart attack. But that's what we find. The effect on yield is much less precisely estimated. So if you look at cotton yield in terms of kg per acre, the point estimates are positive, and the 10%. In some sense, this is nothing to write home about in terms of like this is a slam dunk, because we've got 10% statistical significance for one of our subgroups, right? But all the point estimates are positive, and for cumin, the point estimate for the whole sample is also positive and statistically significant at the 5% level. And cumin is also a crop that we provided a lot of information on. We were aiming to get farmers to introduce cumin as an alternative crop. So we provided push messages with content on cumin. I think there's sort of a bigger meta question, which will be relevant to the second paper I talked to as well, which is there's one thing about can you convey optimal farming practices to farmers, and will they accept that information and act on them? And then there's second question is like what are optimal farming practices, and what should we convey, right? And so how do we know that our agronomist is right relative to what the person in the field knows or does, right? And we don't, to that question right now, I think, have a great answer. I think, yields, the point estimate of yields goes up, but that, I wouldn't want to say that we gave financial advisors to people and they bought a bunch of equities and the equity market went way down this year, and so obviously financial advisors harm people, right? It's a really nuanced question, and yields are something that's pretty stochastic, profits hard to measure. If you take the yield estimates at face value, then the point estimate of profitability relative to costs is very attractive. You're getting $10 in profit for every dollar in the cost of the intervention, but it's not yet I think a home run. I think it's encouraging evidence, and we didn't have a pre-analysis plan, but if we had had a pre-analysis plan, I think cotton yields would have been the variable that we would have focused on. We're also interested in peer effects, right? So there are a number of reasons. So I'm giving you the abstracted version of the paper. If you're interested, I encourage you to read the whole paper. One design decision we took was to randomize at the individual level, and this is probably where the MBAs may be less interested, at the individual level within the villages rather than at the village level, right? So that gave us more statistical power because responses were less correlated by the unit of randomization, so that was good for us. But of course, information is something that can pass from villager to villager very easily, right? So if and in fact, very early on, we were super excited because we went into the field and we did our baseline service survey in August. Then we started the service. Then already in November, we did a telephone survey of treatment and control groups, and we saw changes in pesticide behavior. And exactly the pesticide we were telling people to avoid, monocrotophos, the treatment group was less likely to buy. And we said, wow, this is amazing. That effect disappeared by the end of the study. And we're not equipped now to distinguish whether that was just an ephemeral effect that was statistical noise, or the treatment farmers talked to the control farmers and told them, hey, why are you buying that monocrotophos? It's not good against, or if you're growing BT cotton, there's no reason to use it. But we did, we were at least aware of this problem going into this. So we did do a little bit that would help us measure how information spills over. And what we did at the baseline is when we talked to farmers, we asked them for their 3 primary contacts in agriculture. And we recorded all of that. And then we could go back at the end line and talk to all of those peers. And so if you 3 were my primary contacts, and let's say you 3 were Abiman's primary contacts, I happened to get randomized into the treatment group, Abiman happened to get randomized into the control group, we can then compare you 3 to you 3, and we know that you were talking to me about agriculture and you were talking to Abiman about agriculture, and we can see for differences in knowledge and behavior to measure the spillovers, right? And so we do find some, I think, pretty good indicative evidence of spillovers, of information spillovers. Farmers whose peers were treated were 19% more likely to volunteer the name of our NGO as a source of agricultural information, right? And so it's hard to imagine why they would have done that if they hadn't been hearing about that from their peers. They were more likely to plant cumin. Remember, we had effects on cumin planting in the treatment group. Maybe that spilled over. And they also reported less crop loss due to cotton pest, and a big part of our intervention was cotton pest. So again, I would not advocate this as slam dunk evidence that we've nailed the peer effects, but I think it's pretty interesting and pretty encouraging that some of this information seems to be passing from one party to the next.
How important do you think the fact that your NGO that you used was already well respected?
I think it's probably pretty important. I think obviously trust is a major constraint, and the fact that we're leveraging their name was useful. Yeah, yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I'm spending probably the next 5 years of my life also thinking about generalizability. So I agree that it's an important question. Okay. So another thing we did was estimate willingness to pay, because if you think so the service was free to the farmer to sign up. There was no fee, and you don't pay for receiving calls in India. And even if they wanted to call in and ask a question, they would just give the computer a missed call. The computer would call them back, and then they could interact with the system. So zero cost, which is a great model from their perspective, right? But not necessarily a financially sustainable model, right? So as we were ending the experiment, we concluded the baseline study. We said, thank you for participating in the study. We are now discontinuing it, but if you'd like to continue receiving the service for another 6 months, you can do so for 40 rupees. And we randomly assigned the price at which we made that offer to people. And so we traced out the demand curve. And then there's sort of like a methodology thing. We also compared that to the BDM price revelation mechanism, which at this point had not been tested in the field. That's kind of a second price auction where it's incentive compatible for the respondent to report their true willingness to pay. And so if you're interested in that methodology, it turns out that it's very close in terms of the demand curve. It looks like BDM works just as well as take it or leave it. And BDM is desirable because you get a lot more information than the take it or leave it offer, because you find their exact willingness to pay instead of are they willing to pay for a specific price.
So what is the support you used for the BDM?
40 to 490. And so the NGO was going to be selling the product for 240, selling the service for 240. And so we did not actually do the take it or leave it offers above the NGO's price, because we thought people might come back and complain, hey, how come you charge me twice what they're selling it for down the road? So we have this support, correct? But we did make clear, and another thing we did was I think a lot of evidence shows that just hypothetical willingness to pay exercises are not very correlated with actual willingness to pay. So when we were doing the survey, we said, show me the cash. You really are willing to pay 140 rupees for this? Yes, I am. Here's the cash. And then we'd scratch off the thing to reveal the price. And so that, I think that helps explain. And it took us 3 tries to get this right. You may have seen us complain in our grant reports about earlier attempts at BDM in a weather insurance setting where the farmers' bids were very correlated with the ultimate offer price, which they shouldn't have been. And it was just a problem with communications. Okay. So, I take this as a half full, half empty view of the world. I think 80% would pay $1 for 6 months. So there is a user fee literature in economics that suggests that when you start charging the poor, demand just drops off a cliff, right? But here, if it's 40 rupees, you have between 70 and 80% of the people saying, yes, I'll give you 40 rupees today to continue to have the service. The bad news is it would cost an NGO probably more than 40 rupees to go to somebody's house, explain the service, and collect 40 rupees, right? So that's not a sustainable revenue model if you're collecting cash in person. It turns out that choosing the highest price would be profit maximizing, right? Because there are costs to offering the service per person in terms of airtime. And you may be able to get to a break-even price by charging something like 490 rupees for a 6-month period, but you would decimate demand, right? You'd only have 5% of farmers signing up. And this is, in fact, like RML is a service that does this in India, Reuters Market Lite. They started out as a mass market play, trying to sign up a lot of farmers, and they've given that up, as I understand it, and now we're working on an app that's something like $30 per crop per season to sign up for. So it's the price point is very high. They're hoping to make a profit, but it's not something that's going to reach large number of farmers, at least in the next 2 or 3 years. So we take this as like encouraging but not conclusive evidence of the possibility of ICT changing farmer behavior. 70% report using cell phones for agricultural information in the treatment group. There's a very high level of trust reported in the service. Effects on practices, point estimate effects on yields, pure effects. The revenue model is maybe less certain. Okay, so there's an example of an intervention impact evaluation. And I should say, this individual paper should live in the context of a number of other economists and others, agronomists, who are evaluating ICT for development. And we did a replication in Madhya Pradesh where we're sort of still finalizing the tables. We found lower levels of engagement overall. We've still found systematic changes in behavior, but we found no statistically significant effect on yield in Madhya Pradesh, right? So that was there. Marcel Favchamp and Mitten did a study in 2012 of one of the very early versions of Reuters Market Lite. Again, on paper, it sounds great. You're getting price information about 4 different markets. You're getting daily reminders about weather and crop practices, and they found no effect there. And so the view is kind of, there's some success, there's some not, but I think there's still some, I think, justified skepticism about the prospect of agriculture ICT for ag. I would say Michael Kramer, who's an economist at Harvard, is working on these topics as well, and he has done 3 or 4 really interesting randomized trials just on the ability of text messages to change farmers' behaviors in Kenya, and some very promising results. So he shows that text messages telling farmers about pH results of soil in their area have raised lime usage rates from something like 7 percentage points to 11 percentage points, statistically significant at the 1% level. He then did a replication of that trial and found similar sized effects, again, statistically significant. And he's working with One Acre Fund in that setting. So I think the question, in my mind, is not so much does this work or does this not work, but what types of things work in what settings and for what types of people. And so that's a pretty hard question to answer, but I think it may be one worth answering. Okay, so pause here if there are any questions or comments.
I'm just wondering about the network effects of people using pesticides. So I'm using pesticides, and the next door guy is using pesticide, and then he's using pesticides.
Right.
That's awesome, right? So where my
like
peers are,
the positive spillover and the fact that I'm killing bugs.
Where my peers are located also matters.
I think that's an interesting question, and we did geotag our fields. I think we're treating a small enough fraction of the people in the village that I'm not imagining we're moving the needle. So we've got we have 1,200 people divided by, we have about 30 people in each village. 20 of them are treatment. Maybe our point estimate on pesticides practices is 10%. So 2 more people out of 40, 2 more people in a village are using a better pesticide. So I would guess it's not there, but could be.
Yeah, when I saw the result on the yield especially, that's when
you thought that maybe, or pest attacks, right?
Yeah,
I mean, maybe it's you talk most to your neighbor, and you also get pest infections the most from your neighbor too. So there's, could be, we should probably look at the spatial analysis there.
Why do you think you didn't get an effect in Madhya Pradesh, but you got an effect in Gujarat?
I think execution may be part of it. I think we were relying more on a partner to take care of the local ground. We didn't have a ground team at all there. We just we even ran the service from Gujarat, so some people were even afraid to pick up a phone call from Gujarat because they thought maybe that'll cost them, or give a missed call across state lines. So we had lower levels of engagement, but I think it was about twice as large. It was about 2,400 people, total sample. And I think one other thing we take away from this is yields are very hard to measure, and it may well be that the true, I'm an optimist, but it may well be that the true effect of this is it raises yields by 3%, right? This is a super light touch intervention, right? It's just getting a call once a week with some reminders. But if that's the true yield gain, given how noisy yield measurement is and how stochastic yields are, you may need a sample of 100,000 over a 5-year period to start to be able to say something really concrete about yields.
So a following question on that. So was it the same crop in Madhya Pradesh or a different crop?
It was still cotton.
So what language has been used for the SMS communications?
Gujarati. In here, well, we didn't do anything by SMS really. The SMS reminders must have been in Gujarati. But some of the reminders were voice reminders as well. I mean, that's an important question, is should you work in a text, voice, or app world? And I think if you want large scale now, you need to work in a voice world. In 5 years in India, I think apps are probably the way to go. But Africa, for example, is way behind in both voice and apps, and text may be the only financially feasible thing in Africa right now. Okay, I still have one more paper to present, so I'm torn about whether to go through that or take these questions. I'm happy to do. Okay, and then we'll have some more discussion at the end, if that's okay. This is also a relatively simple paper. I can skip the intervention. How many are familiar with the soil health card scheme? I mean, this is a big deal. The government's giving every farmer a printout that has their name, their soil health report, and what quantity of fertilizer they should use for their plot, right? So that's, this is what a soil health card looks like, right? And that's the level I understand it. It turns out, this is a pretty simple paper, so I can get through it pretty quickly. The level I understand, this is about the same as the level a Gujarati farmer understands it, right? I don't read Gujarati. And one problem is it's kind of information overload. So if you're a farmer and you do read, you'll see that they think your choice crop is hybrid cotton unirrigated, suppose. This is your what nutrients you should be adding. And their first iteration of the soil card just gave people nutrient information. It didn't give them fertilizer information, and they realized that's probably not the best way to go. And so now that gives you quantity of fertilizer you should do. You should do 196 kg per hectare of N, 0 of P, and 0 per K. If you have irrigation, it should be 600, 138, and 250, okay? And I don't know, I think the Indian bureaucracy is in many ways extremely competent, and so they foresee problems like, suppose cotton fails and you decide to go for another crop later on in the season, we should give people information about millet, right? And so then you can look up millet, right? But if you give this card to a farmer, this is what we did in this, the first thing we did in this experiment, really simple. We gave the cards to the farmer. We said, imagine this is your cousin's farm and this is his soil health card. We'll give you 10 rupees if you can tell me how much nitrogen they should use, 10 rupees if you can tell us how much potassium they should use, and 10 rupees if you can tell us how much MOP they should use. Or I'm getting my fertilizer names confused, okay? And the share of people who can figure that out is, I'm skipping ahead here. I'm very far ahead, is, okay, 6%. Right? So 6% of farmers, when offered 10 rupees to figure out how much of these NPKs they need, can actually figure it out. And this isn't quite a random sample of farmers. This is a sample of farmers who are using our service, right? But they don't look all that different than Gujarati farmers. Okay, so this is, you can now, I imagine, anticipate what this paper is going to be about, which is that maybe we could use alternative methods to disseminate information to improve the understanding of these soil health cards, right? And so there's kind of a theory of change associated with these soil health cards, which is we test the farmer's plot, we provide the soil health card to the farmer, it has useful information about what the farmer should be doing, they understand the soil health card, or maybe they don't understand it, but they get advice from an extension worker, or maybe they don't understand it, but they get advice from the agri-dealer. Then they trust the soil health card recommendation and they change their behavior, right? That's the vision, I think, of what the ag minister articulates when they say we should be spending $80 million on this policy. There's earlier work by Ram Fishman that inspired our work, which I think paints a cautionary tale, which was they went around in Bihar and gave 800 farmers soil health tests and then soil health cards and tried to measure whether they changed their fertilizer practicing. It wasn't an RCT, but they anyway concluded that farmers didn't change their behavior at all, and they didn't trust the results from the soil health card. So even if the soil health card said you're zinc deficient, and they said, see right here it says your soil health test says you're zinc deficient, and then they said, here's some zinc, would you like to buy it at a very subsidized price? The farmer said, no thank you, I'm fine. So that's kind of a cautionary tale already.
In this study, what's the performance of the farm been in the recent past for the farmer? If he's doing great,
right?
He'll be like, go away. I mean, I'm doing fine. If it's going horrible,
he
might be like, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't recall what their average performance here is. I mean, I think the sense is smallholder farmers in Bihar may not be at the efficiency frontier, but I could be wrong. So we note that the mobile penetration, which is not, that's SIMs divided by people, so that's not really share of rural people who have a mobile phone, but is substantially higher than the fraction of people who get agricultural extension in India, right? So maybe we, instead of relying on the farmer taking their soil health card to the agri-extension worker, we could provide supplementary information in paper, telephone, video format to improve farmers' understanding, okay? So, sorry, I'm very low on time, so I'll just say that one thing we did in Gujarat was do it, so to answer the question, could farmers get information from agri-dealers, right? So that seems like a very plausible hypothesis. In the US, a lot of people get their financial information from financial advisors who sell them financial products. We did an audit study and hired surveyors to sit inside agri-dealer offices for a day, and we visited all the agri-dealers in 2 blocks. 90% said, sure, you can do this. And then we had our agronomists characterize whether the quality of advice that the agri-dealer was giving was great, hard to say, terrible, et cetera. And the results were not encouraging. So in 40% of the time, our agronomists just said, I don't have enough information to say whether this was a good recommendation or a bad recommendation. But in the 60% of the cases where the agri-dealer can make a recommendation, they were much more likely to strongly disagree with the recommendation than strongly agree with the recommendation. And it turns out that a lot of this, and I had an undergraduate at Harvard who wrote his undergraduate thesis on that, a lot of this comes from the fact that when it comes to pesticides, the dealers seem to recommend too much pesticide, and in too many pesticides and in too high quantities. So the farmer, the bug dies, but the farmer doesn't necessarily learn that they might have been better off using less pesticide. But if your shop earns a commission, then you have an incentive to recommend a lot of pesticide. So what we did is 2 things. One is just we said that old soil health card is information overload. If we know the cotton wants to grow irrigated, the farmer wants to grow irrigated cotton, let's just give them the information they need, which is the 4 fertilizers and the quantity. We also said farmers don't think about hectares, they think about biga in Gujarat, and so let's give them the information in terms of biga. So the theory is, less is more. Okay, so there's another key step in this theory of change, which is, do the soil health cards themselves actually provide useful information, right? And so the government has tested Gujarat. They've been testing soil for 13 years. And what we did, and the soil test results are freely available on the internet. So what we did is we just did a back check, and we tested about, I think, 1,200 plots and sent the soil to a certified lab in Gujarat. And then we compared our test results to the test results on the soil health card. And unfortunately, the results are not encouraging. So the correlation between our tests and the government-reported tests is never statistically distinguishable from 0. And that actually might be okay, because you might imagine that there's vastly different soil in Gujarat than Tamil Nadu, and the soil health card is going to pick that up and make different recommendations. But if you focus on one relatively narrow area, you might not have that much variation, and so it's going to be hard to pick up a correlation, right? But it turns out even these lines are the spaces where the government level recommendations are for low, medium, or high quality of fertilizer. And so, if everything lived within these 3 boxes, then you might say, okay, it's just some noise, but it doesn't matter. Or if everything lived within this box, you might say the soil test is a waste of time or money, but not doing anything else. But we do find dramatic differences in the recommendations based on our tests and the government's. Now this doesn't also, I would say I'm not an agronomist. I picked cotton for one summer when I was 14, but that's as close as I've gotten to the area. We have agronomists on staff in our organization, but there are lots of valid reasons why we may get different results from the government, such as soil changes in quality over time. The government is an average of 2 cropping seasons, whereas we're just taking the results from 1 cropping season. Adding nutrients can change the nutrition levels in the soil. So, but I do think that it suggests that not we, I guess, but India would be well served in thinking a little bit more carefully, or maybe a lot more carefully, about how to use these tests and how to share this information with farmers. And in particular, since there seems to be so much variability, so another possibility is that we just totally screwed up our tests, right? And our tests have no information, but the government tests are perfect. But when we did our tests, it just so happened that we tested the same plot multiple times, because we interviewed, say, 2 cousins, and we asked them, where's your primary plot? And they both said over there. And so a team on Tuesday tested the plot, and a different team on Wednesday came back and tested that same plot. And so we can then match those plots. And we do find a correlation between 0.7 and 0.4 in the test results. So at least if you do the test at the same time and send it to the same lab, there does seem to be some information. But it's not, it's not 100% correlation, and so there's already some noise in there. So I think one takeaway for us is that, and it shouldn't anybody who's thought about statistics for more than 5 minutes shouldn't surprise, is that you may well do better by taking local averages of multiple tests. It's called kriging in spatial dimensions, and reporting those kriged results to farmers than reporting the individual soil health test results to farmers. Okay. But even once you solve the recommendation problem, you still have to solve the comprehension problem, right? Which is we could have the absolute perfect recommendation for the farmer, but if they don't understand what to do, then what are they going to do? And so here we divided our 600 farmers. This is a lab in the field experiment in the sense that we went to the farmers with their cousin, we said, imagine this is your cousin's soil health card, not this is your own soil health card. We didn't do that because we think that's a better design. We just did that because it's much, this was written for a policy forum in Delhi a couple days ago, and we had 4 weeks to do the paper, and so that was logistically feasible. The other was not. And we divided the sample into 4 groups, just the soil health card plus audio recording or plus video recording, or plus we actually sent a live agronomist to explain the soil health card to them. And in all 3 of these settings, the script was the same. We just thought, maybe in person is going to be better than video, is going to be better than audio. It'd be nice to know which is which. I don't think agronomist is a scalable solution. I think audio is scalable now. I think video will be scalable in 5 years. And so, why not test all of those? This is the experimental design we intended to submit, which was half of the sample gets the government soil health card, and then we randomize within that group just the health card plus audio, health card plus video, health card plus agronomist. Half of the sample gets the original plus the soil health card, simplified soil health card. It just tells them the information they need to know, and we do this. This is the design that I submitted because I made a mistake with my human subjects forms. And very unfortunately, this means that we can now not distinguish between how much of the effect is driven by the simplified soil health card and how much is driven by the audio, video, or agronomist. I think the good news is that it's not like the simplified soil health card would be that hard to do. So these results are still policy relevant. The government could print simplified soil health cards and distribute them along with the complicated health cards if they wanted. And we'll go back and do the full experiment, but it won't be in this paper because this paper has to be submitted to the publisher. Okay, so the point of the scripts is just explain to farmers what is soil testing, why do you do soil testing, what the nutrient things mean, and what the implications for your plant growth are. And these were I think, low baseline levels of understanding. So 28% actually know what a soil health test is. 10% can establish a link between nutrients and fertilizer use. And only 8% report they've gotten a soil health card. Only 7% report knowing about the soil health card scheme, which also calls into question the earlier reports from the Gujarat government that 70% of soil health cards have been distributed. So it seems like, at least at this level, these seem not to be making it down to all of the farmers. So when you present an RCT, you typically give a balance test and show that you didn't get really unlucky with the randomization, and indeed we didn't get really unlucky with the randomization. These are the difference between the audio and the soil health card only in terms of understanding the recommendations is always, or almost always, 0 and statistically insignificant. The huge takeaway is that 6% can't even identify the correct fertilizer quantities when they're paid 30 rupees to do so. Government of Gujarat is aware of this. When they review the health card scheme, they say 17% of farmers can't understand the soil health card calculations. So one possibility is we're oversampling from that 17%. Another possibility is that 17% is underestimate of the true scope of the challenge. The good news is trust levels are relatively high. The good news is that the interventions seem to work a lot. So from a baseline understanding of 6 percentage points, we go up to this is a cross-subject comparison. So people who got the audio, video, or agronomist are answering about 40% of the questions on average, or probably more accurately, 40% of the people can answer the questions about soil level, about recommended fertilizer level. So that's a huge increase. What surprised me is that I expected to see the agronomists way outperform audio and video, right? Because at least at Harvard and maybe still at IIM, we still have professors and they still teach. And you have to hope that one of the reasons is because there's some value to a human provision of advice. Maybe not. But so the takeaway is that this intervention can improve comprehension a lot. And then I'll just mention one or two heterogeneous effects, and then I want to leave lots of time for discussion. The videos seem to improve understanding a bit. The point estimate of the audio is positive and not as statistically significant. So sort of if you had a choice, and in fact the cost to deliver either one is about the same, at least at the prices we're paying. It's about 3 rupees to send 8 minutes of audio, and it's about 3 rupees to get 8 megs of data, which is or however many, I did the calculation, however much it would cost to send the data. Of course, the farmer has to have a smartphone and a data plan for video, which is not yet that prevalent. Okay. So one thing we did was look at literate versus illiterate populations. And so maybe this gives us some hint at what an intervention without the simplified soil health card would do, because if you're illiterate, you might not even be able to read the simplified soil health card. So we find, the good news, positive effects of the audio, video, and agronomists between 12 percentage points and 21 percentage points off a base of 0. There's like literally one illiterate person in the whole sample who got one of the questions right. And for the literate population, the effect is much larger. Okay, so it may be that literate people are better at learning than illiterate people. Okay, so in Gujarat now we're doing an RCT. So this is sort of just on that theory of change. It stopped before changes in behavior. In Gujarat now we're doing an experiment where we're giving farmers the results of the soil health cards that we delivered. And we're complementing this not just with information about how to interpret the soil health card, but sort of holding their hand along the planting process. Like if you want to apply fertilizer according to the recommended level, you should buy this much fertilizer for your field in 2 weeks. In 1 week, don't forget to go to the shop and buy your fertilizer. And now's the day you should buy your fertilizer because you need to start planting tomorrow. And sort of walking them along the agricultural production process. We think we're powered to detect changes in yields if we can get a large first stage in the fertilizer. So we'll start to help to answer this question of, are these a lot better fertilizer practices or not? And then I think another thing that may be interesting to some of you who are on the faculty or even PhD students here is we're creating an organization called Precision Agriculture for Development, but one of its goals is to create a platform for research that people can plug into, right? So right now we only have something like 40,000 farmers in Gujarat, but we're in talks with a few state governments in India and a state government in Pakistan to work with them to scale perhaps quite dramatically up into the hundreds of thousands or millions of users. And then you could very easily imagine doing things like testing what's the effect of providing price information to farmers on their marketing decisions, testing, is there a scope for aggregating demand for things like tractor rentals or other inputs, testing behavioral messages, should we give people messages once a week or twice a week or 5 times a week. I mentioned this work in Kenya that's finding, I think, very encouraging results for farmers there. And so, what might you take away from the second paper that is both not obvious and true? And that's kind of the standard I hope for from research. There's some challenges to the government theory of change. Maybe if you're cynical, this is obvious, but the soil tests might not be stable or accurate. And the understanding of cards is extremely low. But it's very easy to remedy by redesigning the card or providing very cheap to provide voice messages to farmers. And thinking, I think, more generally about customizing advice, it may well be that the people with a 12th grade education should get the card that gives them all 18 crops. In case they do decide to change their crops, they can decode what they should do. And people who are struggling with literacy should get a very simple card that they can do. And as you learn more about farmers, you can do that. So the sort of the broader ambition, and again, I need to be clear that we're not advocating scaling this for the sake of scaling. We think that more research needs to be done before we decide that it really is something that passes a cost-benefit test, but is to coordinate these ICT extension platforms around the world. And these are happening kind of without us. Like governments are trying to move to ICT because they realize it's a cheaper way to communicate with people. It's also like you can monitor and know what's going on in a way that's much harder by sending people into the field. So we can build a large database of agricultural practices and outcomes to then run a bunch of tests with many of users to try to understand how to convey information effectively, how to collect information from farmers. I mean, I think this question of what are optimal farming practices for the conditions that farmers face is a very challenging one. And Gates Foundation gave $10 million to Erie in Orissa to do a bunch of farmer field trials to compare farmers' actual practices to sort of the agricultural university's best practices to what Erie actually thinks are the best practices for the farmer's situation in the field. And they did find that the third one performed the best, right? So they've now designed a model that will help farmers, based on many RCTs, help farmers improve their profitability in the rice sector, but they don't know how to convey that information to the farmer. Because right now it sits on a web server in the Philippines. If the farmer is sophisticated enough to go fill out the form, click submit, and take the printout, they can then change their farming practices. But they're now interested in seeing whether you can deliver this via ICT. And so we think that at least for now, there may be a case for philanthropic or government support in the design and development of these systems, because in many ways it's a global public good. What we learn in India can be useful in Pakistan. What we learn in Pakistan can be useful in Kenya. But these countries, or the actors in these countries, may not have a big incentive to do information sharing. I think until the payment banks really take off, collecting payments from farmers is very costly in many settings, certainly in India. And so commercial models that might, in theory, generate consumer and producer surplus, in practice are hard to execute because of the transaction costs associated with payments. And I think that I've certainly done some work, and there's other work that suggests that the private market for information may not always function well. So if you have like agri-dealers or other parties who have incentives to sell you certain products, they may recommend those products more, and the consumers may realize that and be less willing to trust those products. So I think that the trust question you brought up is really important. I think there's both distrust of the government and especially maybe capacity to execute, but at least anecdotally, the view I get is that there's a lot of trust in farmers of the government in the sense they think the government's trying to do things for their benefit rather than profit. So I have 8 minutes for questions, then I have to run over to another room. But I'm happy to take comments.
So a question about trust and comprehension part of things. So a farmer who is not able to read his soil health card is also not able to read his bank passbook. So, but he's able to find someone who can read his passbook for him and withdraw money or fill out form and so on. So why do you think? Do they not see the value in the soil health card, which they are not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say. We did a sort of BDM type experiment where we said, would you be willing to enter in a lottery where if your name is selected from this lottery, we'll come test your plot and you have to pay 200 rupees for the soil test, okay? And 60% of people said, yes, I would pay for that. And when the agronomist explained it to them, another 15% said, so 80% said, I would pay for it. So they do see some value in the soil health card, it seems. Now, we haven't yet gone back to them to see if they actually pay, but we'll let you know.
Like inside Gujarat, there are different kinds of soil available. So red soil is also there, black soil is also there. So was the same advice given to all people?
No. The soil health card will indicate what type of soil the farmer has, and then based on that, medium black. So it says if you have we tested your soil and it came out as medium black.
Coming back to this question of trust on the source of information.
Yeah.
So private source versus the public source, the state. And if there are conflicting signals, then you say that farmers often trust the public source, which is the state information.
Yeah.
But when you bring in NGO, a third party, which is like you, and you have in your experience in your experiment the SHC provided by you and them. So did you test what's the level of acceptance between these two?
Yeah, so we have one question there, which is, do you trust the government or the NGO more? And I think the results are roughly a wash. I'm not sure it's on the table. But I think this is something worth understanding more, and especially if you think about scaling, right? DSC has a great reputation here, but if you go to Kutch, maybe they're not operating there, and people will say, I don't know what you're talking about. So I think that's, my gut feeling is the fact that the farmers can ask a question and get a customized response within 24 hours helps build trust a lot in the sense that they feel this really is relevant information, but we haven't done A/B tests to establish that. Yeah.
So going back to the first paper, right?
Yeah.
So what you get there is a little bit passing on the knowledge now, right? Because if you don't find any increase in knowledge, so that creates a problem for you in terms of whether this is going to have any effects over time. Because if knowledge doesn't go up, what will happen next year?
I guess the question is, am I better off seeing a doctor or not seeing a doctor, right? Doctors solve my problems, my health gets better. I don't learn anything about medicine when I see the doctor, right? If the model is, we hope we can do this for 5 years, stop doing it, and we'll have this long-term positive impact, I think you're right. If the model is, this is just something that's going to have to be available forever, then it seems less problematic.
The other thing is about the agronomists.
I'm sorry, about the what?
The agronomists, right? Because the practices change in the sort of optimal direction according to your agronomist. And you pointed this out in your agronomist. So I think, it's very important for you in terms of where this paper is heading to have some triangulation of the coding that's been done on the best practices.
Oh, yeah, sure. Our agronomists, every question that gets asked, our agronomists reviews the official recommendations of the Gujarati agricultural universities and makes recommendations consistent with those, right? So it's not just, I think you should do this. It's what does the science say? And if he doesn't know, he'll talk to the experts at the local university. So in some sense, it's more of a test of how does this person embody the knowledge that these organizations have accumulated than what's his personal lived experiences and practices.
No, but it's also about if somebody else did the same. If you picked another agronomist to do the same procedure, what is
agree. Absolutely agree.
Do you think that vulnerability of a specific crop, such as cotton, to pest, pests, or weather conditions has an effect on or a particular reason?
I think this service seems to address a pain point of farmers, which is the pests they see change a lot, and they're uncertain about how to treat them. And so being able to get this dynamic interactive information is valuable. If we went to salt farmers in Kutch, and maybe there's just no room for practice improvement, they figured it out, then I imagine they wouldn't use this service much. Is that what you're asking? Or yeah. And I think that I think one question. We observe tremendous demand for the information in terms of people asking questions and listening to the messages. So that suggests at least that they're unsure about what's
around pest issues.
Yeah.
I think the vulnerability plays a role in terms of motivating farmers to access this thing.
Yeah. Yes.
So in your first paper, you study the behavior of person finding your study, because generally Indians they don't like to offend the other person when they ask them.
Right.
Yes, I have started maybe there's one. Does it?
Yeah. So there are two answers. One answer is, we asked all the treatment and control farmers the same sets of questions, like what was your yield? We didn't just go to the treatment farmers and say, how did this service affect your yield? Right. So the second answer is that the surveyors weren't identified with the service. They just said, we're here to survey you about agricultural practices. The third answer is, I think you're right. There's some possibility that the respondent associated the service with the surveyor and had some desire to please us. And they didn't, for example, say anything about price information. But I think, attractive settings for future studies, I think, would be settings like contract farming, where all of the farmers sell all of their output to the government. So you don't even have to ask not the government, sorry, to a firm. So you don't even have to ask the farmers what was your yield. You just know from Frito-Lay, we bought this many potatoes from this person, this many potatoes from this person, this many potatoes from this person. And if we did an RCT and gave half of those potato farmers the service, we could then measure the effects on yield, I think, in a pretty unbiased way.
I have one more question. So government and PCI is having a Kisan call center.
Yes.
They do, how effective they are? They are.
I haven't called them, but I think we've had our agronomists call them, and I think the characterization, I mean, there are relatively few Kisan call center seats relative to the number of farmers who have queries. Our agronomists said, sometimes the questions were answered, but often they sort of said, well, let me take your number, and I'll look into it and get back to you, and they didn't get a call back. So I don't have the number of what is the exact ratio of calls returned, but it seems to be, not 90% would be my sense. All right, I think we're at the hour. Last question.
So when there is information or suggestion given on the fertilizer use, be it in the soil health card or when information is provided, is it mostly on synthetic fertilizers or organic fertilizers are also promoted or recommended or the difference is explained?
Yeah, so the first paper, our services were recommending the generic as well as giving a list of possible brand names. We didn't want to recommend one particular company because we thought that might make people think biased. I don't know, actually. I wish Tarun were here. I can show you what the government soil health cards say. I think they just say, this. And so I don't know. Do you think it matters a lot? Are you saying as opposed to manure? You're talking about fertilizer as opposed to manure, or you're talking about?
As in, when recommendation is given to the farmers to use fertilizers, so what recommendation is given? Like, are synthetic fertilizers?
That's it.
This is only the NPK use.
Yeah, I should know more, but like I said, I'm not an agronomist, unfortunately. Our agronomist would know.
I think there is a column for that.
Okay.
So they recommend farmyard manure in the this.
But it's not on the
recommend farmyard manure, but then so farmer is already using it.
Okay. But it's not on the soil health card. I mean,
it is actually. It's there.
It is here somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, once.
It's hard to understand. It's hard to make it. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments and the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Shawn, on behalf of